Hello everyone, I'm Mike D'Angelo with That's Entertainment, and this is your video review of Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link by Nintendo. Retro games experience their own share of hardships in this day and age. To some, the bygone era represents a time when nothing was worth playing. In those days, you were ridiculed for playing because why would you want to play something that looked so horribly unrealistic? Usually you were adventuring in a game that offered very little story, with very crude graphics by today's standards. There were those of us that championed those games, and still do to this day. But even those of us that wear nostalgic glasses remember the games from yesteryear that were not so fondly appreciated. The Adventure of Link was one of those titles, cited for various issues such as its design, graphics, and even composing. An important question is before us. Is this sequel to one of the greatest gaming classics worthy of its disdain? Following in the footsteps of The Legend of Zelda, The Adventure of Link seemed like it would be a surefire hit. It took place several years after the original game, when the titular hero was 16 years old. You wouldn't know it from the game itself, but the Zelda who lies upon the dais is actually a different Zelda from the first game, and in fact, the very first Zelda that the legend is about. You see, that Zelda has been asleep for many years on account of her greedy brother's reckless actions. In his guilt, he punishes every princess born to the royal family in Hyrule to be named Zelda in remembrance of his sister. Impa, a character who is referenced in the first game's manuals but never actually seen during the course of the game, explains Link's destiny to him. When he finds the Triforce crest upon his hand, he finds that only he can break the curse that has befallen Hyrule's ancient princess. Unlike the original Legend of Zelda, Link already has the items needed to lead him to the final destination. Impa bestowed upon him a set of crystals that has to be brought to palaces strewn across the kingdom. Once in place, they will lead him to the Great Palace, where the Triforce of Courage waits. Of course, not all is well in Hyrule since Ganon's death. The great Prince of Evil has found infamy in his death, which translates to a cult-like status. His many followers want nothing more than to slay the hero, for his death can mean the rise of Ganon once more thanks to Link's blood. Again, this is all set aside for the actual game, although throughout the adventure Link meets up with the citizens of Hyrule that send him on quests and reward him for his troubles. The Adventure of Link was a pretty huge departure from its immediate predecessor. Whereas The Legend of Zelda presented the entirety of its game in an overhead view, the only place this happens for the sequel is on an overworld. Much like in RPGs, you have a chance of being attacked here, though unlike most games for its time, you had a chance to pursue or escape your enemies during your time scouting across Hyrule. Most of these overworld segments are pretty tame. It's when you explore the land's caves and palaces that you face the most harrowing of your opposition. When you do go into battle, you see Link from a side view akin to the most popular platformers of the time. Link's combat abilities are fairly ordinary at first. You can stand and stab, duck and stab, or jump and stab. It's a little more involved than in the original game, but it can seem fairly tame throughout the title. About halfway through the adventure, Link gains the ability to stab into the air and down upon his enemies. Of course, he can also crouch behind his shield to avoid dangers. Beyond that, combat itself doesn't really change all too much, with the exception of one of the game's more interesting additions, a magic system. This magic system is required to progress in the game, offering you amplifications of your power, including a higher jump, a fiery element to your attacks, and even fairy transformation. Speaking of progress, one of the other nice supplements to the game was an experience and level system. As you slay your enemies and find hidden treasures throughout the kingdom, Link grows stronger and is able to endure more damage from his enemies, deal more punishment out, and focus his magical ability to a greater extent. One of the more tried and true mainstays of the Zelda series persists in the Adventure of Link, in the form of item hunting. Each of the palaces, and some caverns, has a treasure that will aid the hero in his quest to unlock the path to the Great Temple. Most of these only affect the overworld map, but some, including the candle, are used during the side-scrolling portions of the game instead. You can also find heart containers and magic potions strewn across the overworld that will add another segment to your health and magic bars. One thing that is surely a letdown to fans of the series is the lack of the more popular items. The boomerang, bomb, and bow and arrow are conspicuously absent, with the exception of the armaments of the evil gorillas. Embracing its RPG feel, The Adventure of Link sends the hero to towns across the land, where he mingles with the citizens, meeting with the elders and weapons trainers, and engaging with the locals. One of the more popular complaints about this installment of the Zelda franchise was its mundane or mediocre music and graphics. Despite releasing in Japan less than a year after the first game, to some it seemed to already show its age. I personally find the game to employ some clever uses of its aesthetics. How little did many of the games of the NES change the backgrounds to something unique? It was most often a simple palette swap. Yet the Adventure of Link has a few different locales to explore, including forests, caverns, palaces, deserts, towns, and even bodies of water. Yes, there were several palette swaps to speak of, specifically when dealing with many of the minor baddies, but for its time, I feel this game had impressive visuals. That's not to say that they've aged very gracefully, but certainly better than many of the earlier polygon games of the N64 and PlayStation 1. Likewise, the music was catchy and well developed. It didn't stick with you quite like the original game or some of the popular franchises like Mega Man or Castlevania, but at least the temple theme was impressive enough to be used in various ways even almost 30 years later, most recently in a variation in A Link Between Worlds. Though The Adventure of Link is often cited as the black sheep of the Zelda franchise, it's hard to argue that it hasn't left a lasting impression on the games that followed. Everything from more dynamic NPCs to a magic meter have followed into the other heroes' quests, and many story elements, such as the name of the towns, have landed in the later titles as well, although this has been retroactively changed to indicate that the sages of later games lent their namesakes to the towns. Heck, even the side-scrolling combat featured in The Link's Awakening in some brief scenes. This game was so culturally important that it inspired other games, most notably games like Faxanadu and Castlevania II. Part of what makes The Adventure of Link so worthy of fans' ire is that it gave its predecessor and every successor such a wide berth. This game was so distinct in its presentation that it sometimes feels like it falls just outside of the franchise it belongs to. But let's return to our point. Is it the worst Zelda game? Perhaps, but even if it is, it's only by a microscopic margin. And even then, that's only if you admit the terrible CDI games that everyone tends to forget about.